Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to introduce Peter Pomerantsev, author of How to Win an Information War, The Propagandist Who Outwitted Hitler. Peter is one of the leading experts on disinformation and propaganda. He's the author of Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, The Surreal Heart of the New Russia, which won the 2016 Royal Society of Literature Ondaatje Prize. And this is not propaganda. Adventures in the War Against Reality. Born in Kiev, raised in Britain, Peter spent about a decade working in Russia's television industry, which gave him unprecedented access to the country's media machine and propaganda operations. In his latest book, which I have here, a Ukrainian translation of which I have here, Peter tells the fascinating story of Sefton Delmer, a British propagandist who became one of the most innovative counter-propagandists of World War II, fighting Nazi disinformation with what he called black propaganda. But this isn't just historical. Peter weaves in his own experience in combating Russian propaganda through the Reckoning Project, an initiative to document Russian war crimes. What makes Peter's perspective so valuable is that he's testified on information warfare to the US House Foreign Affairs Committee, US Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and the UK Parliament Defence Select Committee. So he brings both academic rigor and real-world experience to understanding how disinformation works and how we can fight it. Welcome to the Euromaidan Press podcast, Peter. So, your book takes us on a fascinating journey exploring how peaceful Germans became war-mongering monsters and how the journey of Russians is very similar. So why do the Germans go crazy? And what does that tell us about the Russians?
Delmer was born in Germany, and he saw Germans go crazy twice. He saw it happen in the First World War, and then for the Second World War. He saw sort of authoritarian propaganda working in very similar ways wherever he went. So the Nazis are obviously unique in many ways, and uniquely evil in many ways. But Delmer saw authoritarian propaganda working in very similar ways across German history, but also in other places. He goes to sort of Eastern Europe after the war and sees Soviet propaganda as very similar. So, I mean, it's really got three elements that Delmer keeps on coming back to. One is sort of what you might call identification with the leader. So we often wonder why certain types of political leaders are popular when they're narcissistic, sadistic, aggressive, unpleasant, hysterical. But I think Delmer and some others would say, well, that's the reason they're so popular, because they allow repressed, middle-class, stolid normies to become the very worst versions of themselves. They normalize aggression, sadism, narcissism, and create this kind of like carnival of evil feelings. The second is collective identity, sort of a time of deep confusion. They offer a collective identity, which is a very toxic one, based on a sense of superiority to others and supremacism, combined with a sense of victimhood. And thirdly, and here I think Delmer is most original, they give people individual roles to play when they don't know who they are. They give people a language to speak. They give people a way to structure their emotions, often their erotic emotions and libido. They give people a songs to sing and uniforms to wear, attitudes to wear, and slogans to express themselves through. And in a sense, Delmer thought that was the most important part, because he had a deeply theatrical view of human nature. And he thought that the most powerful propaganda does that, but it does it in a very toxic way, in a very destructive way and self-destructive way. So we can definitely apply all those things to contemporary Russia. In the research that I'm doing there now, you can still do quite a lot of sociology in Russia. So working with teams and message testers in Russia, we find that like the largest correlation between being ready to send your kids to die in the war is to do with belief in a Russian supremacism. A belief that Russia is superior to others and a victim of others. The correlation is very strong, and when you message test propaganda around that issue, people's desire for Putin not to do a peace process goes up as well. So, for example, when you ask most people, do you want You give them two statements. Putin wants peace, Putin wants more war, which are both things Putin has said. They're safe statements. If they've been primed before that, if they've been given other questions beforehand, saying Russia is superior to others and a victim of the whole world, they are more likely to say we want war. Yeah. So there's a correlation between the propaganda of cultural supremacism and victimhood on the one hand, and support for the war, which we usually measure with the readiness to send your relatives to the front, which is a much better indicator than do you like it or not like it. So I think those things are deeply connected, and I mean, Putin in many ways is a different kind of leader to Hitler, but the sort of the archetypal rhythm of his speeches is, we were humiliated, now we're going to dominate others. I mean, his clever stories about being a taxi driver, which I think quite clever propaganda. He was a taxi driver in the 1990s. I mean, it's almost the American idea of like the angry taxi driver. Now he gets to go and shoot up the whole world in revenge for all his repressed anger. All his speeches are sort of built around sort of the legitimatization of sadism and aggression in a kind of emotional cycle. So all these things coincide, and obviously the sort of the sense of a sort of an individual identity is given to people all the time. I think Delmar would have loved social media, which is sort of evidence of his theory of propaganda in many ways. We're all now playing different political roles online, which can be healthy ones, but often very unhealthy ones.
You mentioned an interesting thing about supremacism, because the Germans also had their own idea of supremacism. And they also felt a need for it, just like the Russians. And Delmar noted that the less control we have over our lives, the more propaganda we need, which gives us a sense of ersatz agency. So where do these feelings of supremacism arise? What need do they fulfill in the souls of the Russians, and perhaps there are parallels to how they operated in the Nazi era?
Well, let's start with I think a lot of people who look at these things more professionally, because really this gets you into areas of like, almost psychiatry, not just psychology. But it's interesting. So there were actually a lot of psychoanalysis was obviously very in fashion at that time, and I don't subscribe to every piece of it, but those were the people thinking very deeply about these things. And there's a couple of them that I quote in the book. And Delmar worked with the first professor of psychoanalysis at Cambridge, and they went to the Nazi rallies and they commented on them. And their sense was actually you could do this with almost anybody, as in like you didn't actually need a story of great humiliation in order to get people to feel like they're victims and that they want to dominate others. But clearly it's easier if there's certain social conditions. So in Russia, I mean, the obvious thing is the destruction of the Soviet Union, but I don't think that quite works for me. You hear that a lot. You're like, well, it was the trauma of the end of the Soviet Union that left people so confused that now they need to be fascists. Ukraine went through a very similar 1990s and chose a democratic path. Many countries did, yeah. So I don't quite buy this story that kind of Russian propaganda does itself, that we had these horrific 1990s and therefore now we have a right to dominate others. I think it's much more locked into sort of, without kind of like trying to keep it with sort of quite concrete things, some sort of tradition of defining yourself through humiliating others, coupled with a domestic political tradition of humiliating people within the society. So you humiliate people inside, you humiliate others outside, and it's sort of locked in this endless sadomasochistic cycle. But some people will go much further back than the 1990s to sort of where this cycle started. But in many ways, I see current Russian propaganda as sort of a naked version of 20th century totalitarian propaganda. So that was dressed up in the language of ideology, in the language of big political ideas, but at its heart, it was sort of a vast exercise in sadism and humiliating others. So So I think now it's just more naked and more open in a sense. Sort of you see the kind of psychological workings of it much more openly. I mean, we can go on and on about the roots of it. I mean, I think almost like the roots of it will be, if you're a political scientist, it'll be in the political system. If you're a psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, you know, it'll be in sort of the family structures. If you're looking at it historically, you'll look at the historical conditions. I think all things seem to sort of feed into it. My question is much more like, what do we do to undermine it? So I can't give you a final answer on what is the one reason. You know, I think we can look at it from all those perspectives.
Yeah, but to sum up what you said, it's insightful to see like the Russian system as a system that generates a lot of rage, suppressed emotion, and this rage is then converted into this aggression in war. Something like that?
Yeah, I mean, clearly it's been going on a very, very long time. So you know, I'm not quite sure which starting point we want to choose for it. Yeah.
Okay. So many of us have the futile experience of attempting to break through to the Russians with facts, and they bounce off like from a wall. And why does that happen? And how can we break through to people that are under the influence of such heavy propaganda? What was Delmar's experience, and how can we use it?
Delmar was thinking of several things, really. Firstly is the question of aims. What is it that we want to achieve? Yeah, so his aim was to undermine the Nazi war effort. He wasn't trying to make people believe in democracy. He wasn't trying to reform them. He wasn't trying to do anything like that. The question that he posed was like, how do I decrease mobilization, get soldiers to desert, demoralize the German economy, get bits of the German elites to fight each other? So firstly, there was the question of aims. He didn't believe that there was an important democratic movement in Germany to support. So he thought that all those attempts that the BBC and others were making were hopeless. And he wanted to be very pragmatic. He had a view of human nature that was pretty bleak. He didn't think that people were necessarily good, and certainly not in the conditions that the Nazis had created. And it's not that he didn't believe in facts. He just wanted to find the facts that worked for his aims. So he actually was a great researcher into the facts that would help him achieve those aims. I mean, today we see a very similar process with sort of Ukrainian efforts to undermine mobilization. You know, when the war started, there were all these very naive appeals to the angels of ordinary Russians, like, look at the horror that you're causing in Ukraine. That bounced back. Then there was an attempt to sort of show, you know, Russians who might be tempted to mobilize and their families, pictures of Russian soldiers dying. So don't come to Ukraine, you'll die. After a while, when sort of marketing experts and sociologists started to analyze the reactions to those messages, they found they actually inspired people to mobilize because they cause aggression, and people see the corpses of dead Russians. They're like, well, I'm going to go and defend them. So that backfired. And so then they went through many experiments, and they basically found that the messages that were most effective were largely around the rise of crime rates in Russia. So that criminals were being released into the army, and that if you went to the army, the chances are you'd get, you know, raped and robbed by your co-soldiers. But which is a pretty, you know, that's a pretty obvious message. But much more interesting, that worked with the broader Putin support, and I found that in my research as well. So several research groups have found the same thing, that the most effective messaging is around the rise of crime rates in Russia to undermine the desire of people to send their families to the war. And we think that's largely to do with the fact that the people who support the war the most are very authoritarian. They want Putin's strong hand, they want order, and the idea that chaos is growing in the country because of the war undermines their whole worldview. So this, you know, so it's all factual, but it's finding the facts that will work with the values and worldview and motivations of the people you're trying to influence.
We have very rational arguments there about crime rates, like think about their own survival. But Delmar didn't appeal to the angels, he appealed to the inner pig dog.
The pig dog,
What
yes.
is the pig dog?
What is the pig
Yeah,
dog?
and
Such a good question.
do the Russians have an inner pig dog, or are they only rational and thinking about their survival at the front?
No, I mean, like, so the pig dog, what Delmer meant by the pig dog, it's actually a very common German word, Schweinehund, and it's used in all sorts of different ways within Germany. But what Delmer meant by it, that he wasn't going to appeal to people's belief in human rights or democracy or liberal values. He was going to appeal to their egotism, their desire to desert, their desire for self-interest, their desire for their jealousy, and he was going to stimulate that in ways that were, in a way, not always direct. So Delmer's media were full of pornography, aggression, a lot of colour. This definitely wasn't the BBC. It was very tabloid and really rather remarkable. I mean, I still, as part of the archive that I went through, we have all the transcripts of the shows, and they're pretty fantastic and pretty dirty even by our standards. But he would do a lot of stories about corruption. You know, these sort of garish stories about, like, you know, what mid-ranking Nazi officials were having for lunch, which was based on real research, or, you know, how mid-ranking officers were, like, stealing the good food from soldiers and having it for themselves. But all these stories about corruption, they weren't there to start an anti-corruption movement. They were there to basically normalize corruption and tell the ordinary German soldier or citizen, like, look, mid-ranking Nazi officials are being corrupt. Why should you bother putting in any effort for the Nazi economy? Why should you bother working at your factory? Why should you bother dying for these scum? So he'd never say that, though. So his radio shows were full of people raging how awful this was. It was like, a lot of his programs were like the voice of the soldier. And it would be sort of soldiers going, it's horrendous, you know, the way our superiors are so corrupt. But the aim was to make people more corrupt. So, or he'd tell stories about, like, people deserting, and we would always be like, how horrendous these traitors are deserting, and give details how they desert with the intention of making people want to desert. So he was always indirect. He didn't believe in giving people instructions. He didn't believe in lecturing. He believed in telling very, very detailed stories based on very, very visceral experiences, but which stimulated behavior that was allowed people to take control of their lives and defect from the Nazi project, but with, you know, to indulge their most self-interested sides.
Oh gosh, so he wasn't teaching the Germans to be good, he was teaching them to be bad.
He was teaching them to be, he would say that he was teaching them to be bad, but Delmer was he was a trickster character. He was if he was a character in folklore, he'd be Loki. You know, he was a trickster. He liked causing chaos, and he would position himself as very bad. He's always saying, I'm a baddie, I'm naughty, I'm the dark side of what the British do. I think at the core of it was a deeply anti-authoritarian project, because in stimulating people to think and act for themselves, he was still giving them a way to break through of authoritarian psychology. So I think that, you know, he'd probably say that greed is good at some level, you know, and so I think we have to think when we think about good and bad in politics, I think we have to get beyond moralizing and preaching and thinking that is good. If you're stimulating someone to think for themselves, if you're provoking them to act for themselves, if you're provoking them to break through of a kind of a passivity which has been fed to them by authoritarian propaganda, I think that might be better than good.
Oh yeah, so basically the Nazis were telling the Germans that they would be good by doing very bad things. And Delmer, he was telling the Germans to be very good, and in this he achieved a very good thing.
Exactly. I think I'm going to use that. I might use that today in our public talk. So yes, exactly. The Nazis, that's exactly what authoritarian propaganda does. Yeah. It uses the language of noble and the nation and sacrifice in order to enable genocide and rape. Yes. While Delmer was using the language of naughtiness, greed, corruption, sexual hanky-panky in order to stimulate good.
And
Brilliant.
They were taking back the agency, their own agency, by doing these.
Yeah, I mean, when you
immoral acts,
when
so
you're deserting or
yes.
when you're stealing from your factory, you're trying to get people a bit like late Soviet Union. Instead of working at your factory, go and steal stuff from your factory was kind of what he was stimulating. He was getting people to indulge in their sort of primal individualism,
Right.
which I'm not saying that an unfettered individualism is good, but it's still better than being a Nazi kind of like puppet.
Well, if we're trying to win a genocidal war, then definitely it's good. Whatever helps.
Well,
our
if you can
victory.
win a genocide, yeah. But
Yeah.
without a doubt, there's that. There's the other morality here is one of like your aims. So I think anything that stops a genocidal war is good. But even deeper than that, I think there was something deeply instinctively democratic about what he was doing.
Yeah.
So I think there's a little bit of goodness in Delmer, but he would definitely position himself as what he called a baddie who was indulging people's dark sides.
Right. Well, his approach differed from the approach of the BBC at that time, right? So they were taking sort of the approach that Western media had towards Russians, of educating them, of trying to get them to become good, fight corruption, promote democracy. And Delmer ditched all of that. He decided that's not going to work, right? So what does it tell us about what we're doing towards the Russians today?
Well,
Should we be continuing that?
Yeah, I mean, look, the Ukrainians are doing a lot, firstly, and I think, like with Delmer, we'll find out after the war. I mean, I know bits of research from the first 2 years of the war that, are now more public, semi-public at least anyway, and also done some of my own research, but I think we'll find out about the Ukrainian Delmers after the war. But there is just a question of capacity. I mean, Delmer he wasn't doing psyops. His radios were listened to by over half of German soldiers. They were the most popular radios in Germany, so they were competing with Nazi radio. But he also had the backing of a state, which allowed him to experiment and indulge. He had a team of hundreds of people working in this beautiful, vast country estate outside of London. He managed to persuade the government to give him the most powerful radio transmitter in the world. So he was going to go to the BBC, he got it for himself. So his operation was kind of bigger than the BBC, basically. So definitely bigger than the BBC German service. So he had these vast resources to create these huge projects of cultural change. And I think Ukraine will struggle to do that. I mean, it's just struggling to sort of like control things domestically, let alone internationally. So to do that, you need the resources. And if Ukraine's partners are serious about peace and about restraining Russia, one part of the formula of that, along with much tougher economic warfare, is, of course, making the Russian elites feel uncertain about their control over key sectors of Russian society and the military and the war machine. And I don't think the Russians will be serious about peace until they feel the potential of a lack of control domestically. And because that is one of their key indicators of control. So again, we like to say we want peace with Russia or to force Russia to the negotiating table. That's our official policy. But until we take our information interventions and our economic interventions to a place where Russia is actually uncomfortable, that's not going to happen. So I do think this is an essential element of deterrence. So I think it's ridiculous. I mean, we've been fighting this for 4 years, and 4 years, 3 years, 4 years, 3 years.
It's 3 years. It's 3 years.
Into the fourth year, into the fourth year. We're in the, oh God, it's like my sense of time since the last 3 years is gone. We've been fighting this for over 3 years, and in that time, we haven't created a huge multimedia project just aimed at the soldiers. I'm not even talking about their families. I'm not even talking about factory towns. If we were fighting this war, as we did with the war on terror, we set up dozens of radio stations in Afghanistan. We had huge information operations during our ridiculously unsuccessful intervention in Iraq, but it was, the invasion was successful. So if we were doing this, we would be that would be such a key element of what we were doing. But I just think it's ridiculous. We want to undermine mobilization. We say we want to slow down Russia's war machine, and we haven't done the ABC of undermining mobilization and military morale. I don't know. It just shows you how fundamentally not unserious Ukraine's partners are, but how fundamentally pathetic they are.
You've mentioned that Ukraine is struggling to control things domestically, and as you've talked about Delmar's operations, and in reading this book, I've been recognizing many of these Russian operations against us that follow his playbook. They're also targeting the Ukrainian inner pig dog. They're trying to bring out the worst in Ukrainians so they would desert, so they would disrupt mobilization, so they would lose faith in their leaders. What are you observing from the Russian side today?
Well,
and what can Ukraine do about it?
I just know what Ukrainian experts tell me, so yeah. So a couple of things. Delmar's work, after he published his autobiographies, was super popular in both East Germany and the Soviet Union. So they loved it, and they definitely made. I think it's in East Germany, the head of the East German active measures, foreign propaganda, was obsessed with Delmar, and you had to read his books for your thing. But also look, the Germans were trying to do something very similar to what Delmar was before Delmar started. So the Germans were doing radio stations broadcasting to England, which pretended to be British radio stations, the voice of the Cockney, the voice of the Scottish nationalism, the voice of the Christian peace movement, which were all broadcasting into England, and they were really crap and didn't really work. I just think Delmar took all of that and took it to the next level. But I think democracies are always going to be very vulnerable to that sort of intervention because we're open and because we do encourage people to think and act for themselves. So we're always going to be very, very vulnerable. But we'd have to look in detail about. I haven't looked in huge detail about what the Russians are doing. But yes, it's largely to do with mobilization. It's largely to do with a sense of abandonment, I think. I'm just not tracking it professionally, so I can't really say very much.
So let's imagine that Delmar is with us here today. What sort of operation would he set up? Imagine that we have unlimited resources. We have all the support of every partners that we can summon, that we have all the Russian expats that we need. What sort of operation are we going to launch to break the wills of the Russians to fight?
So look, Delmar always saw what he did in the context of larger operations and military operations. So let's start with something else. Let's start with what is our theory of change around Russia's will to fight? This is a generation of Russian leaders who are obsessed with their sense of control. We know that they're deeply traumatized by 89-91 and the way that the Soviet leadership lost control very quickly. We know from their behavior over 25 years in power that when they see themselves losing control, they go backwards. They're constantly calculating their risks. They're often miscalculating, but they're constantly calculating them. We see that in the reaction to mobilization. They try mobilization, it fucks up, they never try it again. They are bankrupting themselves because they're so scared of it. Yeah? So, and his just over and over and over, when Putin sees something which risks him losing control, he goes backwards. He arrests a lot of people, he shoots some people, but he doesn't usually repeat that thing. So any attempt to deter Russia has to be linked into their sense of control, which is not something that we've tried to undermine, apart from in the very first months of the war when there was this attempt to destabilize Russia financially, but then we decided to stop that. We started a fairly effective attack on the ruble, and then when push came to shove, after having done the greatest ever sanctions on a central bank, we decided to let them off the hook and give them a way to exchange dollars through their huge gas companies, which was essentially a way of going, actually, this is too destabilizing for the world economy, we're going to stop this. Yeah, and we let them off, and they obviously read that as our fear, which it was. So since then, we haven't done anything to actually make them feel insecure. That wasn't our approach under Biden. God knows what our approach is now. So you'd have to think about that. So I don't think there's one silver bullet, but there are moments when we see the Russian system in panic. And those are the moments, these exogenous shocks, those are the moments that you would increase the pressure. So the Kursk operation at that time, a year ago, when that happened, Putin's rating collapses to under 60. The whole system freezes. You have this incredible scenes of like the sort of Voyenkovo posting stuff and then taking it down, which means there's someone screaming at them from the Kremlin saying, don't fucking post that. So total chaos, Putin's rating collapses, the army doesn't know what to do, no one knows what the hell to do. In that moment, you should have been piling on the pressure. You should have been doing NATO exercises in Finland, blocking the Baltic Sea so that the Shadow Fleet can't get through, putting new sanctions on every port that Russian ships go to so they can't trade the oil, secondary sanctions on China, and all escalating and escalating and escalating in a very short period of time. And on top of that, you add the information operations, which would have to be feeding into that atmosphere. But for them to be effective, you need to have been preparing them. So again, I would start with the themes that we know are most important for the Kremlin now, not in the future, not decolonize Russia in 100 years' time. They don't care about bureaucrat independence right now. The things that they're really sensitive to are Putin's rating, people's attitude to the ruble and insecurity around the ruble, short-term loans. Yeah, there's a kind of credit crisis in Russia. Something to do with mortgages, maybe doing something around that. So maybe you'd be developing business news inside of Russia, and then, I think Delman will be thinking about that. Obviously, anything to do with the soldiers and mobilization. The biggest vulnerability there is around soldiers' families not getting paid for what happens to the soldiers. So those sorts of issues, and then maybe. So I think that bunch of issues. So economy, stability of the economy, stability of the ruble, soldiers' economic compensation, not their human rights or anything like that. No one cares about that. So I think those seem to be the issues. There's a huge amount of mistrust of China. So something around China will betray us, I think, is something very, very important. So anyway, there's a whole map of issues that the Kremlin can't control. I don't know if we'll do slides in this meeting, but there are a lot of studies about the areas where the Kremlin tries to impose control over social opinion and behavior and fails. So you'd be working on those. And at the moment of a kind of escalation of many military and economic actions, you would already have those channels of communication and you would be escalating them. So that's how it would work, and that's how Delman will be planning it. But the first point of analysis is working out what are the Kremlin's fears. So not our fantasies about what it fears, but actually what do they fear.
Mm-hmm. Do we know what they fear?
Yeah, there's different, we don't fully know, but we know what they spend money on, we know what they care about, we know what they can't control. So yeah, we have a fairly good idea.
Okay, last
We
question.
don't totally know, but we have. I mean, if I had the data points, then the services who have more access to information have much more data points than I do.
I could talk to you forever, but we have to wrap up. So last question. Delmar's vehicle was the radio, which everybody listened to in his time. What would he use today?
So we live in a multimedia age, so you need everything, and you need scale. I mean, I think that's the issue. You need scale. So if you're doing online operations, I mean, marketing people will give you the maths, but you need a lot of posts.
Right, a lot of posts on social media.
A lot of posts, but it's all about it's all about how you use the multimedia. So you'd be using radio, you'd be using satellite TV where it's relevant. You'll be using, you'd be, some of the great things the Ukrainians do, hacking into Russian local TV and playing. You want all of those. You want to have a sense that you're everywhere. Robocalls, SMSs, everything. You're using everything, and you're thinking how they work together to create a kind of like, you know, a full spectrum movement. So there is no one thing, and it's much easier than it was in the Second World War.
So there we have the answer. How do we break through to the Russians? How do we break through the propaganda? Peter gave you some ideas. I'm hoping that the viewers who can do something about it are watching our show today. If you want more videos like this, please subscribe and become a patron of Euromaidan Press, and we'll be sure to get you the brightest minds on Russia's war against Ukraine. Thank you and goodbye.